August 12, 1960. The Sands Hotel, Las Vegas. 500 people sat in stunned silence as champagne dripped from Sammy Davis Jr. S face onto the stage floor. A mob enforcer was laughing. Sammy was paralyzed with fear. The music had stopped mid-note. And then Frank Sinatra walked onto that stage and did something that should have gotten him killed. What happened in the next 5 minutes was so dangerous, so unprecedented, that it was erased from history for 38 years. Until a retired sound engineer found a tape in his garage that proved every word of it was true. This is that story. The music didn't fade out. It stopped. Completely. Mid-note, the orchestra went silent, as if someone had cut the power to the entire Copa Room. 500 people who'd been laughing and drinking seconds earlier now sat frozen, staring at the stage where Sammy Davis Jr. stood alone, champagne dripping from his face, his $800 tuxedo ruined, his dignity shattered in front of the most powerful audience in Las Vegas. It was August 1960. The Sands Hotel, Frank Sinatra's domain, his castle, the place where he made the rules, where even the casino bosses deferred to him, where his name on the marquee meant sold-out shows for months. But tonight, none of that mattered, because sitting in the front row, laughing with a sound like breaking glass, was Anthony Big Tony Castellano, a capo from the Genovese family, a man who controlled the docks in New Jersey and had a reputation for violence that made even other mobsters nervous. Sammy stood there, champagne soaking through his shirt, running down his neck, pooling at his feet. His one good eye was closed, the other, the glass one he'd worn since the car accident that nearly killed him, stared blankly at nothing. He was trembling. Not from cold. From the effort it took not to respond, not to react, not to give this man the excuse he wanted. Big Tony had been heckling for 20 minutes. Loud enough to be heard, quiet enough to have plausible deniability. Calling Sammy boy, making jokes about his eye, asking if he did tricks. The kind of racism that was casual in 1960. The kind that people pretended not to hear because acknowledging it meant choosing a side, and choosing a side against a man like Big Tony meant consequences. Frank Sinatra had been in his dressing room when it started. He was supposed to go on after Sammy, close the show like he always did. He was reviewing his set list, smoking a cigarette, when he heard the music stop. Not end. Stop. That's when he knew something was wrong. He stepped into the hallway. His stage manager was running toward him, face pale. "Frank, we've got a situation." "What kind of situation?" "It's Sammy." Big Tony Castellano just threw champagne on him. On stage, in front of everyone. Frank didn't say anything. He just walked past his stage manager, down the narrow corridor that led to the wings. When he reached the side of the stage, he could see everything. Sammy, soaked and humiliated. Big Tony, standing now, holding the empty champagne bottle like a trophy. His 5 bodyguards flanking him, hands inside their jackets. The audience, silent, waiting to see if this was somehow part of the show. Frank had known Big Tony for years, had done favors for him, had taken his money, sung at his daughter's wedding, looked the other way when shipments came through the sands that weren't supposed to be there. This was the world Frank lived in. You didn't get to be Frank Sinatra in 1960 Las Vegas without making accommodations with men like Big Tony Castellano. But this was different. Frank stepped onto the stage. He didn't run, didn't rush. He walked with that same unhurried confidence he brought to everything, the walk that said he owned the room, no matter who else thought they did. The spotlight caught him immediately. 500 faces turned from Sammy to Frank. Big Tony sat back down, smiling. "Frankie, there you are. I was just having some fun with your boy here. No harm done, right? Frank didn't look at Big Tony. He looked at Sammy. Really looked at him. Saw the champagne dripping from his chin. Saw the way Sammy's shoulders were hunched, the way he was making himself smaller, the survival instinct of a black man in 1960, who knew that fighting back could get him killed. Frank walked over to Sammy, put his hand on Sammy's shoulder. The room was so quiet you could hear ice melting in glasses. "Sammy," Frank said quietly, "go backstage, get cleaned up. Take your time." Sammy didn't move. His voice was barely a whisper. "Frank, it's okay. I can finish the go backstage." Frank repeated, still quiet, still calm. But something in his voice made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. Sammy walked off. The audience could hear his footsteps, the wet squelch of champagne in his shoes, all the way to the wings. Frank turned to the audience. 500 people. Celebrities, high rollers, politicians, mobsters, the most powerful room in Las Vegas. He looked at them for a long moment, then spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, there's not going to be a show tonight." The room erupted. Confused murmurs, angry shouts. These people had paid a fortune for their tables. Some had flown in from New York, from Los Angeles, just for this. But Frank raised his hand, and the room went quiet again. "There's not going to be a show," he repeated, "because I don't perform in rooms where my friends are disrespected. I don't care who you are. I don't care how much money you have. I don't care who you know. If you think it's funny to humiliate someone because of the color of their skin, you can get the hell out of my casino." Big Tony stood up slowly. He was a big man, 6'3", 250 pounds of muscle and scar tissue. His face had gone red. "You talking to me, Frankie?" "I'm talking to everyone," Frank said. "But yeah, Tony, I'm talking to you. You know who I am. I know exactly who you are. Then you know you don't want to do this. You don't want to make me look bad in front of all these people." Frank took a step toward the edge of the stage, closer to Big Tony, close enough that he didn't need to raise his voice. "You made yourself look bad, Tony. The moment you threw that bottle, the moment you thought you had the right to humiliate a man who's more talented than you'll ever be, who's worked harder than you can imagine, who's earned more respect than you'll see in 10 lifetimes. You did that, not me." Big Tony's bodyguards moved forward. 5 men, all armed, all ready. The audience shrank back. This was about to get ugly. Everyone knew it. In 1960 Las Vegas, men like Big Tony didn't get challenged. They didn't get embarrassed. And when they did, people disappeared. But Frank didn't move. He stood there on the stage, in his tuxedo, unarmed, alone, staring down 5 armed men, and a mob boss who'd killed people for less. "Tony," Frank said quietly, "you've got 2 choices. You can apologize to Sammy, right now, in front of everyone, or you can leave. But if you leave, you're never coming back. Not to the Sands, not to the Flamingo, not to the Desert Inn. I'll make 1 phone call, and every door on this strip will close to you. Your money won't be good. Your name won't mean anything. You'll be done here." The bluff was audacious. Frank didn't control every casino in Vegas. He didn't have that kind of power. But he was betting that Big Tony didn't know that. He was betting on his reputation, on the myth of Frank Sinatra, on the idea that maybe, just maybe, he really could make that call. Big Tony's face was purple now. The veins in his neck stood out. His hand moved toward his jacket, and then a voice came from the back of the room. "He can make that call, Tony." Everyone turned. Standing in the doorway was Giancana, the boss of the Chicago outfit. one of the most powerful mobsters in America. A man Big Tony answered to, whether he liked it or not. Sam walked into the room slowly. His bodyguards stayed at the door. He walked alone through the silent crowd until he stood next to Big Tony's table. "Frank's right," Sam said quietly. "You embarrassed yourself. You embarrassed us. Apologize." Big Tony looked at Sam, then at Frank, then at the 500 people watching. His entire body was rigid with rage, with humiliation, with the knowledge that he'd just lost something he could never get back. "I apologize," he said. The words came out like gravel. "To Sammy," Frank said from the stage. "Not to me. To Sammy." Big Tony closed his eyes, took a breath. When he opened them, he looked toward the wings where Sammy had disappeared. "I apologize to Mr. Davis." Frank nodded once. Then he turned to the audience. "Show's over for tonight. Management will refund your money. Thank you for coming." He walked off the stage. The orchestra didn't play. The lights didn't go down. Frank just walked off, into the wings past the stage hands and waiters who'd watched the whole thing, back to his dressing room, where Sammy was sitting on the couch, still in his wet tuxedo, his face in his hands. Frank closed the door, sat down next to him, didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, Sammy spoke. "You just ended your career for me." "No," Frank said. "I just made it clear what it stands for. Big Tony's going to kill you. Maybe, but he's not going to touch you. Not ever again. Not while I'm alive." Sammy looked at him. His one good eye was wet. "Why? Why would you do that? You know what he is. You know what he can do." Frank lit a cigarette, took a long drag, stared at the wall. "My father was a fireman in Hoboken, worked his whole life for the city, and when he got old, when his hands started shaking from the years of climbing ladders and breathing smoke, you know what they did? They cut his pension, said he didn't qualify, left him with nothing. And I watched him sit at our kitchen table, this man who'd saved lives, who'd run into burning buildings, and I watched him cry because he couldn't feed his family." Frank looked at Sammy. "And the men who made that decision, the politicians, the bosses, they went home to their nice houses and their full tables, and they slept fine. Because to them, my father wasn't a person. He was just a number, just another worker they could throw away when he wasn't useful anymore. And I swore, right then, that I would never be like them, that I would never look at another human being and see something less, that when I had power, I would use it to protect people, not hurt them." He stood up, walked to the door, turned back. "You're not just my friend, Sammy. You're my brother, and nobody treats my brother like that. Not Big Tony, not Sam Giancana, not the President of the United States. Nobody." Frank left. Sammy sat there alone, in his ruined tuxedo, in Frank Sinatra's dressing room, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel small. The story of what happened that night spread through Las Vegas like wildfire. By morning, every casino boss, every performer, every person who worked on the strip knew that Frank Sinatra had shut down his own show and faced down a mob enforcer to defend Sammy Davis Jr. The consequences came quickly. Big Tony Castellano never set foot in Las Vegas again. Sam Giancana, whether out of respect for Frank or simple business calculation, made it clear that Tony had overstepped. Within a year, Tony was reassigned to operations in Florida, a demotion that everyone understood as punishment. But the real consequence was quieter, deeper. After that night, the unwritten rules at the Sands changed. Black performers weren't forced to enter through the kitchen anymore. They could stay in the hotel rooms, not just perform and leave. They could eat in the restaurants, use the pools, be treated like the artists they were. It didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen everywhere. But it started at the Sands, because Frank Sinatra had drawn a line. And once he drew it, others had to respect it, or explain why they wouldn't. Sammy Davis Jr. never forgot. For the rest of his life, whenever someone asked him about Frank, he would tell versions of this story. Sometimes he'd embellish it, make it funnier, safer. But in private, with people he trusted, he'd tell the truth, that Frank Sinatra had risked everything for him, had stood between him and a loaded gun, had looked at the most dangerous man in the room, and said no. When Frank died in 1998, Sammy had been gone for 8 years, taken by throat cancer in 1990. But at Frank's funeral, his daughter read a letter that Sammy had written to Frank years before. A letter Frank had kept in his desk drawer. "You showed me what it means to be a man," the letter said. "Not by how loud you could sing, or how much money you could make, but by who you stood next to when everyone else stepped back. I will love you until the end of time. Your brother Sammy." The story of that night in August 1960 was never reported in the newspapers. The Sands management kept it quiet. Big Tony never talked about it. Even Sam Giancana, in all his later interviews and investigations, never mentioned it. It became one of those Vegas stories that everyone who was there remembered, but nobody could prove. Until 1998, when a retired sound engineer from the Sands published his memoir. He'd been working the board that night, had recorded the whole thing, the way he recorded every show just in case they wanted to use it later. The tape sat in his garage for 38 years. When he finally digitized it and released segments online, the world heard Frank's voice, calm and clear, telling 500 people that the show was over because his friend had been disrespected. The recording went viral before viral was a word. News outlets picked it up. Historians analyzed it. People who dismissed Frank as just another entertainer with mob connections heard something different. They heard a man choosing principle over profit, friendship over fear, because that's who Frank Sinatra was when it mattered. Not the chairman of the board, not the voice, not the man who hung with presidents and mobsters, just a kid from Hoboken who remembered his father crying at the kitchen table, who remembered what it felt like to be powerless, and who swore that when he had power, he'd use it to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. That's the Frank Sinatra history tried to erase. The one who didn't just sing about love and loss but lived it. Who understood that real strength isn't domination. It's knowing when to stand between the powerful and the powerless and refuse to move. Sammy Davis Jr. spent his whole life being told he wasn't enough. Not white enough. Not tall enough. Not tall enough. Not tall enough. After the accident took his eye, he'd learned to survive by being smaller, quieter, more accommodating, by taking the humiliation and turning it into a smile. But on that night in August 1960, Frank Sinatra looked at him and said, "You are enough. You are more than enough. And anyone who can't see that can answer to me." That's a love that transcends friendship. That's brotherhood. That's the kind of loyalty that doesn't show up in headlines or history books, but lives forever in the hearts of the people who witnessed it. And that's why, when people talk about Frank Sinatra today, they should remember more than the music. They should remember the man who stopped the show, who faced down the mob, who chose his friend over his fortune. Because in the end that's what matters. Not what you sing, but who you stand next to when the lights go out and the real test begins.